Welcome back, everyone, to the myCOW podcast. Now, if you haven't already, please jump onto the website, mycow.nz, and sign up for our newsletter. It allows us to keep in touch with you about any new episodes that have come out on the podcast, but it also allows us to update you on what we're doing with the myCOW app as well. So please jump on there if you haven't already. Now, as always, these podcasts are not designed to be for specific advice on farm. They are more to get discussion happening with your farm consultants, your vets, and other rural professionals around areas that we can go after improving performance on farm. Right, so this is episode number 1, where we're looking at feed test data and how we use feed test data to unlock performance in our cows. So there's 3 key areas that we're going to cover today. The first one is, what is the data that we're actually collecting from the feed or the herbage tests? The second is how and when we collect this data. And the third area is the nuts and bolts. So that's actually how we use that data to improve performance on our farm. But before we get into that, we have a quick word from our sponsor, Agvance.
Hi, I'm Jason from Agvance Nutrition. A solid transition plan is crucial to start your cows off on the right foot and set your season up for success. The impact of feeding a balanced diet with the correct mineral supplementation cannot be underestimated. We've developed Premium Transition Premix to ensure we give the right mineral supplementation to your Springer cows at the right time. So get in touch with us on the 0800 number or via our website, and we'll be happy to get you sorted.
Before we look at the specifics of what's in the feed data, I want to talk a little bit about the why. So the why behind feed testing is really to get a good bank of information on exactly what's in the feed so that we can make better decisions around planning where we put the cows, what type of silage we put into them, how much fibre we need, and also the mineral supplementation. So that sort of leads me into the type of data. So when we take feed tests, we want to take tests of the at least 2 or 3 most significant parts of the Springer diet. So you'd want to take a test on 2 or 3 of the paddocks or pastures that the Springer cows are going to go onto. And then you'd also want to test the silage, whether it be the maize silage or the grass silage that's going to go into that Springer diet. And also we can test things like hays or some of the concentrates, particularly if they're going to be more than 2 kilos of the total diet. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be seeing data-wise. So when we take a feed test or a herbage test and we send it off to the lab, there's a whole host of things that we're going to get back. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview, then I'm going to dig into what each of the specific labs actually give us in the feed test. So we're going to get numbers back on energy, protein, the fibre fraction in the feed. A lot of the labs also do a DCAD calculation. That DCAD calculation can be done yourself using the potassium, sodium, chloride, and sulfur fractions from the herbage test. So if the lab doesn't provide a DCAD calculation, that's okay. You can take the potassium, sodium, chloride, and sulfur percentages from the herbage test and do that calculation yourself. And alongside those minerals, we're also getting calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, and a whole range of trace minerals if you've selected those on your test as well. So all that gets pulled together to give us a really good picture of what's going into the cows. Now, there's a whole lot of other factors that we need to use alongside those tests. Those factors are feed wastage. So just because there is a 70% calcium in the feed doesn't mean that the cows are going to get the exact units of calcium that calculates out as. If there's 20% or 25% pasture wastage in the Springer diet, then that's going to mean there's 20-25% less calcium going into the cows. So looking at wastage is really important. Looking at feeding mechanisms, so how you're feeding the pasture, the silage, the different things, so that you can better calculate that wastage. Looking at weather, periods of wet weather, you're going to waste about twice as much feed as what you do when it's dry. And also bear in mind, cows' requirements go up a little bit in bad weather as well. So I usually factor in a 10 to 15% increase in bad weather for maintenance on top of what's been wasted. So something to consider there. And also the balance of energy and protein in the diet as well, which we're going to talk about more as we go on. So there's a whole host of labs in New Zealand that do this feed testing, and I don't want to take away from what anyone's doing, But for the interest of time, I just want to focus on the main three in New Zealand. So that's Hills Labs, Eurofins, and ARL. So Hills Labs do a fantastic extended feed profile, which gives us dry matter, ME, crude protein, ADF, NDF. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in detail as we go, so don't get too bogged down in the acronyms. They're also looking at lignins, soluble sugars, starch, digestible organic matter, which is really important, and then also your minerals, so your nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, sodium chloride, and your trace minerals as well. So there's quite a range of pieces of data there, which can be quite confusing and hard to work your way through. And so that's why getting these feed tests and then working with your rural professional, your nutritionist, or your vet to figure out where the DCAD is and the balance of energy, protein, and also minerals is really important. Going on, Eurofins, another excellent lab. They do a Super Animal Health Plus test, which I generally use for transitional Springer feed analysis. So that also gives us a dry matter, ME, crude protein, NDF. Also gives us a DCAD calculation. So slightly less in the feed profile than Hills, but you can extend that test to a further advanced feed test, which will give you a bit more information. Sometimes that's important, sometimes it's not. It just depends who you're working with and their level of skill around translating that data into decisions that you can make with a feed. The Eurofin Super Animal Health Plus test also gives us a whole host of minerals, so your nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, and chloride again, and a full range of trace minerals. So well-rounded test, very useful. So use that test a lot in Canterbury as well as the Hills Labs test. And last is the ARL test. So also very similar to both the Hills Labs and the Eurofins test, covers off your main feed components. Its standard feed and silage test plus a comprehensive pasture analysis gives us a very similar feed profile to Hills. It's quite a broad profile, which is really good. And then it gives us a full mineral profile as well, which is essentially very similar. The only difference is it has added in fat and ash, which is quite useful with our silage tests as well. So it's a little bit more of a blended test, but all three tests are really good and they're similar in price and will give you a really good range of information. And again, what's really important is finding the right people to help you interpret that data, and so that it's not just wasted money and increased data, it's actually data that we're turning into insights, which we're going to talk more about as we go on. All right, so we can nail all the technical stuff really well, but what about the practical? When do we take these samples? What's really important around sampling and handling and that sort of thing? Well, the key thing is we want to try and grab those samples reasonably close to when the transition period starts. I find it most useful to take your pasture herbage test around 8 weeks before the start of calving. It gives us a week or two to get the analysis in and to pick through it, and then another couple of weeks to get our feed and also our mineral supplements sorted before we hit that 21 to 28 days pre-calving, when we need to start getting those cows geared up and supplemented well through that transition period. So a lot of people in the industry push back a little bit and say, oh, well, the feed's going to change in the next 8 weeks from, let's say the start or the middle of June through to the start or middle of July when we start kicking into things. Yes, that is correct. Definitely the energy can shift a little bit. Sometimes the fibre and dry matter levels in the plant can shift a little bit. Crude protein will shift around somewhat, but it shouldn't be too significant. But the mineral profile stays pretty consistent. As plants mature, they do increase in calcium and magnesium and decrease in potassium slightly. But the good thing about getting those herbage tests early is if the potassium is a little bit high, then at least we're making that calculation of DCAD when the plant is at its very worst. And generally, we're not growing a massive amount of grass. So usually we're within about 200 kilos of dry matter per hectare of where we're going to be when those cows go into that paddock. So we might be taking a herbage test that's sort of, 34 to 3,600 cover, and those cows might go into 38 or 4,000 cover. Or, even if at the lower point, it might be 2,600 cover and they're going to go into about 3,000. So there will be some shift there, but it's not too significant. And we've done I've been doing herbage tests for nearly 20 years now for designing transition and springer cow diets. And I still find that herbage test information really useful in making good decisions about which paddocks we should put the transition cows in, and what we need to do around the supplement and the DCAD. The next thing to think about is how we actually take the sample. So you want to always take a transect across the paddock, so corner to corner, and always try and sample the average part. So don't sample the tallest grass, which can often be a fertility patch where there was a bit of manure or a cow's urinated. And we also don't want to take the lowest grass, which is often the most infertile area, as that will skew the result. So we always try and take the average, and we want to grab at least 10 small grabs in a paddock, ideally about 15. And when you're testing paddocks, you might want to test 2 or 3 different paddocks. Ideally, you want to do 1 sample per paddock, because what that does is it gives you the opportunity to choose. And sometimes if these are the only 2 or 3 springer paddocks we have, we'll put the early calved cows, which are less likely to go down with metabolics, so your younger cows, into those high potassium paddocks. And then by the time we eat those out, and then we have some of the older cows coming through that are a little bit more susceptible to going down, we'll try and put those into the lower potassium paddocks. And bear in mind that while we're going through the springer period over sort of 6 to 10 weeks, those paddocks are also going to change. They're going to grow. And as we get through the later part of winter, the potassium, protein and energy levels will come up in that grass. And so that's often when we start seeing a few more niggly issues with downer cows or metabolic disease. All right, the last practical note is around how we handle the sample. So you want to grab your 10 to 15 grabs, put them into the sample bag. And the most important thing is that you get that sample away the same day. If you can't get it away the same day, make sure it goes straight in the fridge. If it stays out in a warmish environment, it doesn't have to be really warm, just warm-ish. That grass will start to silage and it will go off, and that will have a big negative impact on the quality of the results that you get back. So it wants to go straight in the fridge, or if it's going straight to the courier office. The great thing about these companies is they'll generally send you a prepaid courier bag. And so basically you put the sample in the bag, it's prepaid, you drop it into the post office, and then it goes straight onto the overnight courier. So it gets to the lab very quickly, which is ideal. What you don't want is it knocking around in the back of the ute for 2 or 3 days, and then going into the courier and then get sent off. So keep it cold and get it away as quick as possible. Practically the same steps apply for all other feeds. So if you are testing silage or hay, baleage, or whole crop silage, any other maize silage, any other feed that's going into those cows, try and grab that at the same time as you're getting your pasture samples. And so you might end up with 3 or 4 different samples. Keep them cold. Try and take an average. So, a maize stack, you might take 4 or 5 plugs down the stack. Or if you're only going to use a portion of the stack, you can maybe just sample that portion. And same thing applies for silage stacks. And obviously your baleage, you want to get at least 3 or 4 cores out of a random set of bales that are going to be used over that period, so that you're making sure that you're getting a good representative sample. Now we get to the pointy end of the podcast where we actually talk about what we can do with the data itself. So before we do that, though, I want to talk a little bit about utilization. So it's in the industry, we've heard a lot about the sort of 90% rule around ME, or energy allocation in particular. But there's been a lot of disparity, and wearable technology is now sort of giving us a little bit more of an insight around rumination and appetite and actual cow intakes. And it's showing that there is a lot of disparity between what people think they're feeding and what they actually are. And the tricky thing with that is it is actually really hard to calculate with really high pasture covers, variable dry matter levels in the feed, and so on and so forth. So I say all that to say that it's really important to know exactly what's going into the cow and use the data to measure it. And we're going to talk more about this in further episodes, but making sure that we are pretty close to 100% of maintenance in terms of our allocation. So that's making sure that we've done our feed analysis so that we know roughly what's in our feed, and then we're watching our cows to make sure that they are also telling us that we are pretty close to the mark. So what we don't want is we don't want to be aiming for 100% of maintenance and we're feeding 70. or we're aiming for 100% of maintenance and we're feeding 120%. We do not want our cows losing condition before they calve, but we also don't want to supercharge them or overheat them too early before they calve either. Both situations knock appetite, they knock cow recovery post calving, and result in a poor performance in our cows. All right, so you've taken all your herbage samples or your feed tests and you've sent them off to the lab, and you've got a whole lot of data back. So let's pick through some of that data. I'm not going to go through every single data point, but I'm going to talk around each of the key areas and what we're looking for in that data and how we manage that data to get the best result. So the first one up is always energy. So energy can be split into three different parts. So the amount of sugar that's in the grass, the amount of starch, the amount of fat, and then obviously the overall ME value itself, which ME is actually metabolizable energy. So it's the amount of energy that's actually available to the cow from that feed. It's not the total energy that it actually contains, it's the amount of energy that's available, which is why as our fiber level goes up in the feed, our ME comes down because the availability of that energy is limited. So when it comes to energy and ME, we are looking for around 20% of cow live weight as maintenance. So that generally ranges somewhere between 80 and 120 megajoules of ME, depending on the live weight of your cow. So if you work around that rough 20% of live weight, that will get you pretty close. And remember, obviously your younger cows are going to be a little bit lighter than some of your older cows. And so sometimes making some small adjustments to the feed to make sure that we're trying to keep the cows within that really tight 100% of maintenance window can be really effective. Right, moving on from ME and diving just a little bit deeper, if we look at sugar, sugar can be a really useful component in a transition diet. Again, we don't want to put so much sugar in that we blow our ME, so we push our ME too high, but having some sugar, so a quarter of a kilo of molasses or 3 or 4 kilos of grass that's had a bit of sunlight on it can give the cows that little boost in glucose as they're going through a very stressful time. So having a little bit of sugar in the diet can be really useful. And if we're coming into some bad weather, sometimes we'll introduce a bit of molasses or try and increase the amount of sugar that's going into those cows. Starch is another energy source that we will see coming through in the feed test and the herbage test. Starch is really useful for prepping the rumen, particularly if the cows are going to be eating some starch in early lactation. And so having a half a kilo of grain or a bit of maize grain or having maize silage in the diet can be really useful. There's some good research that shows that using starch to increase the energy density of the diet through transition and early lactation can actually flow through into better reproductive results. Now, there's a lot of moving parts there, so you can't just say, I put starch in and get better repro. But what it does show is the energy density is really important, and using starch in that transition and through into early lactation period can be really useful. Fat is another energy source that comes in under the list, but with fat, we need to be really careful. Fat is okay as long as it's kept to a minimum. So when it comes to palm kernel, that's generally where we see the largest proportion of fat coming into the diet. So I generally encourage my clients to stay at or below 1 kilo of palm kernel in the transition diet. And the reason for that is fat upsets rumen performance. So it upsets the rumen bugs, which is the last thing we want to do. And secondly, we can get the formation of calcium soaps in the rumen. So that fat grabs onto calcium and basically locks it up and makes it unavailable, which is the very last thing we want to do through transition when our cows need a lot of calcium to start producing colostrum and getting into milk. The last thing to bear in mind around fat is if the pasture is better quality than what you've seen in previous years, so it's nice and green and it's looking really rich and potentially a bit higher in ME, then it likely is higher in fat as well. So the higher nitrogen, higher crude protein the pasture is, generally the higher the fat level is. And so if you're starting to see some oil slicks on the manure with your freshly calved cows, then that is a really good indicator that we've got a reasonable amount of fat going through. So in that situation where you think that the grass is a bit better quality and there's a bit more fat there, then we might want to cut out the palm kernel to try and reduce the potential impact of too much fat that is upsetting calcium balance in the cow. All right, the next feed component is protein. Now, I'm really passionate about protein because when cows are mobilizing fat or condition to increase the amount of energy available, they need amino acids to utilize their energy efficiently and effectively. So when our cows calve, they can't eat enough to maintain the amount of milk and the amount of energy that they need to get themselves through that early lactation or colostrum early lactation period. And so they make that up by mobilizing a bit of stored fat, which is completely fine as long as it's done efficiently and the cows don't lose too much condition. Now, protein level in the transition diet is really important for this. In early lactation, around 20% of the protein that the cow requires, she mobilizes out of her muscle tissue. And that's because she just can't eat enough protein to maintain her needs. What's really important through transition is that we don't start mobilizing that protein because we are feeding a really low protein diet. So generally, I like to have protein or crude protein percent in the total diet at around 14 to 18%. And that is quite a reasonable amount of protein. It sits most cows at around that 1400 right up to about 1800 grams of pure protein. At 11 kilos of dry matter allocated to the cows, that sits them at around that 1500 right up to 2000 grams of protein. And I know 2000 grams of protein is a lot, but it is a time of the year where having plenty of protein in the diet is a really positive thing. Now, we need to be really careful. Quality of protein is also very important. We have crude protein as a measurement in the herbage, but we also have total protein measurements coming through the system as well. And the difference is your crude protein is actually just a calculation from the nitrogen level in the feed. And nitrogen is not necessarily true amino acid protein. So a protein is made up of quite a few different elements, which I won't go into today. But what's really important is the quality. So having high nitrogen content going through, which is pushing up the crude protein level, is not as useful to the cow as what a high quality protein diet such as soya meal, good quality Australian canola or other sources will actually provide the cow. So I often put a small amount of soy meal into those transition diets just to make sure that we have plenty of rich protein that has amino acids, peptides, and all the goodies in it that the cow needs. The next bit of data that we're going to collect off our herbage feed test is fibre. Now, I don't necessarily look at the pure number of fibre as much as I look at the fibre content of each different feed. So what I want is I want a really good fibre-rich diet, which allows me to, one, control the ME, so make sure that we don't push above or below that 100% maintenance of ME, but it also fills the cow up and it keeps her warm. And so having a high fiber diet option like hay, poor quality baleage can be really, really useful in terms of keeping that cow full, keeping her happy. Because one of the biggest issues with transition cows is they come under hunger stress. So you don't want to go in and feed your Springer cows at, say, 10 o'clock in the morning, feed them out their silage and shift their break, and then they've cleaned everything up by sort of 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they're hungry right through the night. What you want is you want them to clean up their allocated feed and then have a bit of straw, a bit of hay, or a bit of poor quality baleage that they can just pick away at. And if they're feeling a little bit unsettled, they can grab a bit of that fibre, especially if the weather's a bit miserable and it's really cold. They'll actually eat a bit more fibre to fill up their rumens, get them ruminating really well, and then that produces heat, but it also reduces the hunger stress on the cow. So I can't emphasize more how important fibre is in our transition cows. And I'm going to talk more about that right through the series because fibre is a really key part of how we unlock potential in our cows by transitioning them really, really well. Now, DCAD is a metric that we measure or calculate that is becoming a lot more commonly talked about in our industry. Now, DCAD is the dietary cationic anionic difference. Now, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but it's the difference between the positives and the negative charged elements in the diet. So the positive charged elements are generally made up of potassium and sodium, but also magnesium, calcium, and others. then the anions or the negative components are generally made up, or most largely made up, of sulfur and chloride. So the great thing about feed testing is we're getting a percentage of the amount of each of those elements in the feed. So we can use those to calculate the DCAD and make sure we've got everything in balance. So let's say you've got 4 kilos of grass going in, you've got another 6 kilos of maize silage or grass silage, and you've got another 2 or 3 kilos of hay going in. You might have done your DCAD calculation and you've figured out that it's a 450 or a 350 DCAD. And then alongside that, you look at the amount of mag chloride and mag sulfate, calcium sulfate, ammonium chloride, all those other ingredients, anionic salts that help bring that DCAD down. You might find that once you bring all that together, you're actually got a DCAD of around 20 or 30, which is ideal. So with DCAD, we want to be in that range of no more than ideally 50 milliequivalents. And we don't want to be too negative. We don't want to be much more negative than about 50 milliequivalent, minus 50 milliequivalents. So between minus 50 and plus 50, there's a real sweet spot somewhere in there. And it's tricky because it goes up and down based on the weather, how much the cows are eating, and changes in the grass, and so on and so forth. So we manage that the best way we can. But if you can get the DCAD between that minus 50 and 50, then that's a really good range. Now, there is other products out there. I'm not going to talk all about those in this podcast, but we will talk about those going forward another day. All right, that leads really nicely on the amount of mineral that is in the feed analysis. So we are looking at calcium percentage, we're looking at magnesium percentage, phosphorus percentage, sodium, sulfur, chloride, nitrogen, and a whole lot of other elements. So we want to keep all those in a really tight balance. Now, the key ones to be balancing outside of the DCAD is your calcium. So we want to make sure that the amount of calcium is above 0.75% of the total diet. That makes sure that we're supplying the cows enough calcium going through that period, particularly if you are on a farm that has low calcium in the feed, and also you have been feeding a low calcium diet through the dry period. So those cows may have low calcium levels in the bone. So making sure we're getting plenty of calcium into those cows through that transition period. But what's really important also is that we're not giving calcium in the calcium carbonate or lime flour form. We want to give it in a form like calcium sulfate or calcium chloride, or also a calcium buffer. Those forms don't upset the DCAD, and they are readily available to the cows through that transition period. Now, onto phosphorus, we want to be aiming for 0.32% of the total diet. You can get as low as 0.28, but if we're getting any lower than that, there is the potential that we're getting an imbalance of phosphorus and calcium, which we don't want. So aiming to get between 0.28 and 0.32% total diet of phosphorus. So magnesium, we want to be around 0.2% total diet. Now, it's really important we don't go too high in magnesium, because magnesium competes with calcium and phosphorus for absorption. But at the same time, we want to make sure we're not too low, because magnesium also helps improve the absorption or availability of calcium and phosphorus. So we want to have a really nice balance there. And it is a reasonably tight window with magnesium. So next episode, we're going to talk about blood testing, and that's where you can really hone in on what you're doing with magnesium. But aiming for 0.2% of magnesium in the feed test is ideal. And lastly, we have sodium. Sodium also wants to be at 0.2%. We don't want sodium too high, but we also don't want it too low, because sodium is a really important mineral for metabolism. It helps that rumen function really efficiently. Now, interestingly, potassium, we only need about 1.2% total diet potassium. Unfortunately, a lot of our diets are more towards 3 or even 4% total potassium. So it gives you a bit of an idea of the imbalance and why we have to limit pasture in our transition cows, and why it upsets the DCAD and everything else. So yeah, just an interesting little side note that potassium really only needs to be around that 1 to 1.2%. Right, the last factor we're looking at in our feed tests is trace minerals. Now, they're often a bit overlooked, because farmers might say, oh, I've got trace minerals in the water, so I don't need to worry about putting any trace minerals into the Springer mix. The tricky thing with transition cows is they don't always drink a lot, and it can be quite dependent on the weather. And so I do like to have some trace mineral supplementation going in directly to the Springer cows as well as what might be in the water. So keeping that in balance is really important. We want a decent amount of copper, zinc, selenium, cobalt, iodine, but I'm going to talk more about boron, chromium, manganese as well as we go on. With copper, we want around 12 parts per million in the total diet. Zinc, around 60 parts per million. So that's actually gone up from about 35. So the new NASEM requirements for zinc have increased substantially, which is really exciting. We've been looking at research for quite some time now about the positive effects of increasing zinc, both sulfated and chelated forms, and the positive effects it has on immune system function and everything else. So now we're aiming for around 60 parts per million of zinc. Selenium, only about 0.3. So selenium's a tricky one. We generally dose selenium, especially through that transition period from 10 up to maybe 12 milligrams per cow per day. Cobalt also is required at around 0.2 parts per million. And boron, as I mentioned it before, the requirement is around 20 parts per million. So it's actually quite high. So we're pushing boron levels a lot higher now in our transition mix. Boron is a very important catalyst for the absorption or uptake of calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus. So we're putting 120, even up to 150 milligrams per cow per day of boron into our transition and also our early lactation mixes now to really try and increase the amount of calcium and magnesium phosphorus that cow can absorb. Chromium is a mineral that is really important in liver function. It sits actually quite closely alongside of biotin. So chromium helps to increase the sensitivity of insulin. Biotin helps to drive glucose production in the liver. So they actually work quite synergistically. So chromium will often have 7 up to 9 milligrams per cow per day, so quite a high rate, whereas a lactating dairy cow, we might only have 4 to 6 milligrams of chromium. Manganese sits in a very similar space to copper and zinc, where it's very important for increasing oxidative capacity in the cow. So the ability the cow has to grab onto any free radicals, any toxins, any nasties that are happening in the cow, and they need to be gotten rid of. Copper, zinc, manganese, really important for that. Particularly important coming into mating as well to protect the development of those oocytes. And the development of those eggs actually starts in the transition period. So how we look after our transition cows, keep that stress low, keep the right supplements going into them actually helps to improve the quality of the first egg or the first oocyte that cow is going to produce. Now, monensin's another one we'll often be putting into the transition mix, although we are not measuring it in the feed test. And lastly, vitamin E. Vitamin E can be tested. It's not that commonly tested in the feeds. It's something that is really important if you're coming off crops in particular, but we often have an element of vitamin E in the transition mix. But once those cows are on a decent amount of fresh grass, so sort of 8 to 10 kilos, then their requirement for vitamin E supplementation drops off because there's plenty of vitamin E in fresh grass. But once you're giving a large amount of silages, the vitamins are all degraded through that silaging process. So important to have a little bit of vitamin E going in there as well. Lastly, other things to think about in the feed analysis are toxins or any waste or byproduct feeds that might cause inflammation and upset the balance in the cows. So, for instance, high levels of DDG or other waste feeds like carrots and apples or bread can cause or drive inflammation in the cow. An increase in inflammation can upset the liver. And when you upset the liver, you basically increase the amount of ketone bodies that are produced as fat is metabolized through the liver. And that can also upset the calcium balance in the cow. So what high ketone bodies do is they reduce the sensitivity of the cow to the parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone is key to releasing calcium or maintaining blood calcium balance in the cow. So if we're feeding a whole lot of high toxin load feeds or feeds that are causing inflammation in the cow, we're making that cow more sensitive to ketosis and more sensitive to metabolic disease or becoming a downer cow. So as we wrap up, the last things to think about is it's really good to have all these metrics around what's happening with the feed, but don't forget to use your visual cues around what's happening in the cows. Are they a bit unsettled? Are they under stress? Are they wasting more feed? Is the allocation of feed not consistent? So the animals are, some animals are getting more grass, some animals are getting more silage, and some animals are not getting as much supplement as mineral supplement as others. So all these sort of cues are really important to be used alongside the feed data. And lastly, blood test information is really useful at backing up what we're seeing is going into the cow with what's actually been metabolized and the overall balance in the cow, which we're going to talk more about in episode 2. So thanks heaps for jumping onto the podcast. It's been awesome to have you with us. If you haven't already, jump on the website and register for the newsletter so that we can keep you updated with what's going on. And again, thanks to our key sponsor, Agvance, for making this all happen. So thanks again for jumping on, and we'll see you again soon.